Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review a controller, and this one is from Anbernic. Now, I've featured a lot of Anbernic products over the years, but it's always been retro handhelds. This is the first controller they've ever made. Now, as is tradition with Anbernic, they are using a name that makes zero sense. It's called the RG P01. And when I first got my hands on the controller, I figured it would be an open and shut review. After all, the Anbernic controller looks almost identical to the 8BitDo Ultimate, one of my favorite controllers. So I figured it'd be a pretty easy thing to review. I would basically see whether or not it stacks up to the 8BitDo controller, and if it doesn't, I wouldn't recommend it. But then, of course, things got complicated, and that's because they recently announced the price. And if you had asked me a few days after first testing these controllers, I would have said they're probably about $40. And so imagine my surprise when I found out that they were $18 plus shipping. And that price point is crazy, but it also kind of makes sense. After all, if you're not going to innovate in the controller space, the best thing you can do is just undercut everybody else. Because somehow this controller has almost all the features of the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth controller, but at half the price. And so that's what we'll focus on in this review of the Anbernic RG P01. And so without any further delay, let's dig in. Okay, to start, let's talk about all the various features of the Anbernic RG P01. And obviously we've got three different color options, as you can see right here. The first one they're calling a beige white, and it has these lavender buttons. And then we've got the solid black one, which they're just calling black. And then finally, we've got this one called Radiant Purple. I'm not sure where they're coming up with these color names, but they are pretty unique. The battery on this is 600 milliamp hours, which is pretty standard for controllers at this price point. And I found this gives me about 8 hours of battery life altogether. Now, in terms of connectivity, we've got three different options. We can plug it in just standard wired, and it also comes with a 2.4 gigahertz dongle. This means we can connect it directly into a PC or Nintendo Switch via USB and still have nice wireless connectivity. And then also it has Bluetooth 5.3, so you can also connect wirelessly without having to use the dongle. Next, let's talk about polling rates. So the higher the number, the lower the amount of input latency. And the polling rate will depend on the type of connectivity. So 400 Hz for wired, 200 Hz for 2.4 gigahertz, and then 150 Hz for Bluetooth 5.3. Now, you can find controllers with much higher polling rates, but they're going to be a lot more expensive. Instead, these polling rates are pretty similar to other controllers that are at a similar price point. Now, connectivity and polling rates are all well and good, but it really matters at what platforms you can use it with. And X-Input works with just about everything. For example, with PCs, you can use it with Windows and Linux and SteamOS and Mac, but it'll also work with Android and iOS and iPadOS as well. And then finally, this also works natively with Nintendo Switch. It's also a pretty lightweight controller. It's 200 grams, which makes it about 85 grams less than an Xbox Series controller. And in terms of features, we've got Hall sensor analog sticks and triggers, and then also RGB lighting around those sticks. Finally, in terms of pricing, like I mentioned before, it is $18 plus shipping. And the amount of shipping will depend on where you live, but for example, for me, it is $12 on AliExpress right now. Also of note, during the first few days of launch, which will be the same day that this video comes out, it will be a little bit cheaper. It'll be $15. And also bear in mind, you'll see a bunch of sales from time to time on AliExpress, and then also it'll probably get on Amazon eventually as well. And so once the prices have kind of stabilized and the dust is settled, I expect this to be about a $25 controller. So now let's move into an unboxing, and Anbernic sent out these controllers for review, but like always, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. We've got a very plain box with a couple of its features written around the sides, but let's go ahead and open it up. Inside, we've got a USB-A to USB-C cable. This can be used for charging as well as wired connectivity. And then also we've got that 2.4 gigahertz USB-A dongle. Now this has a cap on it, which I assume you're probably going to immediately lose, just like me. And it also has a button on the end of it that you will tap in order to connect to the controller. We'll test that out later. And then finally, it has a little LED light on it to indicate when you are connected. We've also got an instruction manual that will walk you through the majority of its features, but we'll also go over that here in this video. So looking at the controller itself, and my first impression here is that I am not a huge fan of these colors. Let's take this beige white one here with the lavender buttons in particular. I don't really mind the color scheme between the two, but it's not the only colors on the controller. For example, we've got this really big and gaudy gray sticker on the back which has all the info about the controller. In addition, the Anbernic logo on the front is a type of maroon color for some reason, and so this is just a little bit odd. Now Anbernic sent me all three so we can take a comparison against all of them, and so this is what they look like. And honestly, the one that's standing out to me the most is this one on the left, the Radiant Purple. Some of the things that bother me about the white model, for example, that Anbernic sticker on the back, just kind of blend in a little bit better. And I also like the look of the white controls on the purple background. And then of course, I'm always a big fan of these rainbow colored buttons, and I think these are actually pretty neat. They have a matte texture to them, and the colors themselves are not super saturated. I think it's a little bit subtle. So I think among the three, this one's probably my favorite, and it is the most unique looking. Now, if you're looking for the cleanest experience, I think that's going to be the black controller. Even the rainbow A, B, and XY face buttons are a little bit more subdued because the color is only on the letters. And it is worth noting also this has the Xbox style A, B, and XY layout. And so yes, first impression here is that I'm not a huge fan of any of these colors, but I can live with them. Now my second impression is a reference back to the introduction, in that this feels like a dead ringer for the 8BitDo Ultimate controller. And I've been using those 8BitDo controllers for years at this point, so I know exactly how they feel. And I have no idea how the whole controller manufacturing thing works and licensing in China, but it really feels to me like they use the exact same factory. Because feeling the controller in your hands is almost a pitch-perfect experience. There are some subtle differences, like the location and placement of the menu buttons, but really when it comes to the overall design, I think this is too close to call it a coincidence. Now for my part, I don't think it's a bad thing. I love the 8BitDo Ultimate controllers, but it does make me wonder how they got so close in terms of design. It almost feels like the Anbernic controller are licensed from 8BitDo. And I think the best way to drive home this point is the fact that the Anbernic controller almost fits perfectly within the 8BitDo dock. Now it's not a perfect fit because there are these three metal prongs at the back of the dock. This is meant for wireless charging pass-through. And the Anbernic controller does not have this, so it doesn't fit perfectly, but you can see that it is a very, very close fit. And then finally, my third impression is that the overall texture of the plastic feels very good with this controller. It has almost the exact same plastic texture feel as the Xbox Series controller as well as the 8BitDo Ultimate one. It also has the same type of grippy, bumpy texture on the back, much like an Xbox Series controller and the 8BitDo. And so yes, overall, this has been a very comfortable controller to hold and gives me a very significant Xbox vibe. Okay, now let's talk about controls. We'll start with the analog sticks first. And like I mentioned, these are Hall sensor sticks, and they feel pretty smooth. They definitely have a plastic on plastic type of feel to them, and they have about the same amount of resistance on the sticks as they do on an Xbox controller. So again, it's just a very familiar feeling all around. Now the texture around the stick caps is a little bit different than you may expect. This one has a circular or a ribbed feeling to it. It's very similar to what you will find on a Gillikit controller. To give you a comparison, an Xbox or an 8BitDo controller, it has a more bumpy texture, and I prefer that over the circular one. In the end, I would say that both of these types of controllers have the same amount of grippiness to them, but I just like that bumpy texture more. Now, using a gamepad tester app here, I found that I had a full range of motion and it had a Hall effect kind of feel to it. So all those issues that we have with the other Anbernic sticks, things like cardinal snapping, I'm not seeing that here at all. It does give a circular input, which means it's not going to go into the 4-quadrant corners, and that can be a good or a bad thing depending on what you prefer when it comes to an analog input. For me, I don't really mind a circular input, but I did want to make a note of that difference. Regardless, when it comes to analog stick input, I didn't have any issues with these controllers over my week of testing. And I tried out a variety of games, emulation and PC games. I did a bunch of testing on a laptop review over the past week, and I mostly used this controller, and everything worked great. Now by default, once you get connected, your RGB lights around the sticks are going to be in a rainbow pattern, and it's pretty easy to change that pattern on the controller itself. To do that, you're going to press down on the analog stick to press R3 and then hold it. From there, you're going to tap on the screen capture button, which is below select. And every time that you tap it, it's going to cycle through a bunch of different color options. To start, it's just going to show a solid color and it'll cycle through the different options. And then after that, it's going to have what they call a breathing pattern. So it's going to be very dim and then it'll light up with more color and then go back down. And again, the more you press that capture button, the more it'll cycle through those different colors. And then finally, after pressing it about 16 or 17 times, the RGB lights will turn off. As far as I can tell, there are no brightness settings, so you can't make them dimmer or brighter. All you can do is cycle through these patterns. And it is worth noting that the firmware that I'm using right now, as of release, does not have the ability to remember your pattern. So for example, if you were to turn off the RGB lights and then also turn off the controller, the next time that you turn the controller on, it's not going to remember that you wanted them to be off. It's going to go right back to that initial rainbow pattern. And so that means you'll have to press the button another 16 or 17 times to get back to turning it off. And I found this to be one of the major annoyances with using these RGB lights. If you only are going to use the rainbow pattern, then it's no problem at all. But if you're going to use anything else, you either have to memorize the number of button pushes or just kind of leave it as it is. At the very least, my preference would be that they were off by default and you had to press a button combination to just turn them on in the first place. I know that gamers love their RGB lights, but I think this is a little bit much. Okay, moving on, let's talk about the D-pad, and this has a rubber membrane connection. And so this has a very classic and retro feel, very similar to what you would find on a Super Nintendo controller. And for the most part, I think this is going to feel exactly as you may expect, but I did find one little difference, and that is that the D-pad itself is elevated quite a bit. My guess here is that the rubber membrane they're using below is a little bit stiff. If we compare this to the 8BitDo controller, you can see that this one is inset into the shell a little bit more. And what this means is the 8BitDo controller has a little bit less pivot and is not quite as snappy. But personally, I think the 8BitDo one is really well balanced. If anything, the Anbernic one just seems a little bit too elevated. Let's try it out with actual game testing. We'll start with my Contra test. So here I'm going to press down and then rock the D-pad left and right, and ideally the character would only barely move. But as you can see here, the character is moving quite a bit. I wouldn't say it's going as far as failing the Contra test, but it is getting very, very close. And to me, this is an indication that the pivot point might be a little bit too high, that we're getting too much pivot. Now ideally the controller is going to break in a little bit over time, and so it might not be as sensitive. But as it stands right now, yes, I feel like I can kind of rock this a little bit more than I would like. And so long story short, I would play a game like Contra with this D-pad as it stands right now, but it is a little bit on the sensitive side. Now the next game I like to test with is Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. And so here I'm trying to see how easy it is to hit a diagonal. And when it comes to your quarter circle moves, you know, things like a fireball or a hurricane kick, it absolutely is fine. It's also pretty easy to do a dragon punch, but not quite as easy as a fireball. It took me a little bit of time to adjust to the high pivot point, but after a while I was able to pull off the move most of the time. But there were some moments where I was missing the input, and I think it has to do with that pivot again. I think the pivot point is so high that I'm missing a diagonal. So long story short, I would say that this is a mostly good D-pad. I would give it maybe a 7 or an 8 out of 10. And I feel like if I use this controller daily for like a month, I wouldn't have any issues whatsoever. I think that one of two things are going to happen. The first is that the rubber membrane is going to soften a little bit with use, but then also I'll probably acclimate to the overall feel a little bit more. Now let's move on to the face buttons, and these thankfully are a little bit more black and white. They also have a rubber membrane connection, and I really like the feel of them here. They've got a nice satisfying amount of travel to them and just feel very similar to a modern controller. There are some subtle differences. For example, these have a flat shape to them and they also are matte in texture. If you compare it with an Xbox controller's buttons, these are a little bit more rounded and also glossy. And I would say the 8BitDo Ultimate buttons are somewhere in between. These ones are also glossy like the Xbox controller, but are a little bit more flat. Either way, yes, I really like these face buttons, one of my favorite aspects of this controller. Now also on the front, we've got our 4 menu buttons. So we have select and start on the top, and these also are rubber membrane. They feel great. After that, we've got our screen capture button. They call this one cap, but yeah, that's what it means. And then to the right of that, we've got our home button, which will bring up the Xbox menu on PC or, home on Switch. Next up top, we have our Bluetooth pairing button. And the way this works is super simple. Let me walk you through it real quick. If you just press and hold the pairing button, it's going to go automatically into switch mode. And so this is how you connect to a Nintendo Switch. If you want to connect with X input, for example with a PC or even with a mobile device, then you're going to press and hold the X button and then the Bluetooth pairing button and hold them for a few seconds. And it'll flash like this when it's ready to pair. Now if you want to connect with Android, you're going to do the same thing but with the A button. So again, pressing that and then the Bluetooth button, and then it'll start flashing. And this time it'll flash on the third icon. And then finally, if you're going to use the USB dongle, you're going to do the same thing, but you're going to press and hold the Y button instead. And so you'll plug this into your PC and then also press this little button to start the pairing, and then they'll connect. And then after you've connected it through whatever protocol or device that you're using, it's going to remember the last thing you used. So then you just have to press the home button and it'll connect. To the right of that, we have our USB-C input. This can be used for a wired connection, but then also for charging. And of note, I tried it with a bunch of different charging bricks and cables, and they all worked great. So everything from a 15-watt charger up to a 100-watt charger, all the way down to just a standard USB-A to USB-C charger of 5 watts, all of these worked great. It's kind of relieving to get something from Anbernic that actually charges with any cable or plug, so that's pretty cool. Next, let's talk about the bumpers and triggers. Now, the shoulder buttons have a rubber membrane connection. Again, very similar to the 8BitDo Ultimate controller, but not quite as clicky as something like on an Xbox controller. Either way, I do find these buttons to be light to the touch, and they are not very loud either, and so I think they're pretty great. Next, we have these analog triggers, and they feel pretty good. They have the same shape and feel as a PS4 or that 8BitDo Ultimate controller. However, one thing I noticed right off the bat is that the travel or throw for these analog triggers are a little bit shallow. Now, when using a gamepad tester app, I am able to get a full range of motion. So if I want to go from 0 to 100 or anything in between, I do have the room to be able to hit that. The big issue here is the physical travel from 0 to 100 just feels a little bit low. And I think whether or not this is going to be an issue for you depends on the type of games that you plan on playing. So here I am playing Forza Horizon 5 over Xbox streaming on my Android tablet. And here I feel like I could use a little bit more range. It's easy enough to be able to floor it. I can always push it down and that's pretty easy to do, but if I wanted to get to maybe half or 75% speed, it is a little bit more subtle than I would like. Ideally, I would like more travel distance here from 0 to 100. Let's take a look at the 8BitDo Ultimate controller as an example, and I would say this one probably has about 25% more throw. And for me, when it comes to analog input, this is just about perfect. And so that is one minor complaint I have about these analog triggers. If you're going to be playing something with a subtle analog input, it may not be enough. Now, on the other hand, when you're playing something with more quick reflex controls, for example, a shooting game or even on Nintendo Switch, then this is actually going to be a good thing. This makes it feel a little bit more like a hair trigger input than it does a full analog. And so while it's not ideal for a racing game, I think it's pretty great for shooters. It's kind of a mix between the two. And it also makes sense because this is supposed to work with the Nintendo Switch, which does not have analog input. And so by reducing the throw, it does improve your gameplay on a Switch. And finally, let's take a look at the back and the buttons that we have here. To start, we have the M1 and M2 back paddles. And setting these up is very easy. Let's use Mega Man X as our test case. This game really only uses 2 buttons, so I'm going to map them to jump and shoot. Let's start with the jump button, which I will map to the right paddle. To do that, you're going to press and hold on the back paddle and then press the select button. From there, the LED light is going to blink slowly. You can press the A button to set the jump and then press the back paddle again to lock it into place. Now, every time we press the back paddle, it's going to press the A button. Now let's do the same thing, but with the left paddle. Same process, I'm going to hold the M1 button and then press select. And then once it starts blinking, I'm going to press the X button and then I'll press the back paddle again to lock it into place. And so there we go. Now we've got both buttons mapped to the back. And so theoretically, I can now play this game without touching the face buttons at all. But to be honest, this is super awkward, but it will come into play with certain games. For example, when playing a dual stick shooter game, something like Halo or Destiny, you can then map those buttons to be like your reload or jump buttons. And that'll allow you to play the game without having to take your thumbs off the analog sticks, which just gives you a little bit more control. And then finally on the back, they have what they call the T or turbo button. And you can use this to turn on turbo for any of the buttons, but it does have some other functions. For example, if you press T and then select, it's going to remap your ABXY pattern. And so this will switch it so that the A button is on the right and then the B button is down below. It obviously is not going to change the pattern on the buttons themselves, but that's how you would switch back and forth. In addition, this controller does have dual asynchronous rumble. It kind of feels like an Xbox controller's rumble, but it doesn't have rumble in the triggers like those do. Either way, I felt it with both X input, so in a PC or even on my iPad like this, but then also in Switch. And I think it is pretty decent rumble. The reason why I'm bringing it up is because you can also adjust the rumble strength by using that T button. All you have to do is press the T button on the back and then go up and down with the left analog stick to adjust the vibration. It only has 3 settings and I prefer the middle one, but if you want it stronger or weaker, this is how you would set it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about testing. I already showed how to do the different connection options, but let me show you how it actually works on these different devices. So like I mentioned with Android, you're going to press and hold the A button, then the pairing button, and then just go into your Android settings and then connect via Bluetooth. And of note, you don't have to use the Android setting to connect. You can also use the X input setting, and I often will use that more. Now, when it comes to an iPad or iPhone, you are going to want to use X input. And I appreciate the fact that they use the X button for X input. It just makes a lot of sense. Either way, when it came to game testing, I didn't detect any input lag in most scenarios. I tried it with a bunch of phones and tablets, and everything worked well with one exception. And ironically, the one connection that had a bunch of input lag was using an Anbernic device. Now, specifically, this was with the Anbernic RG P01, so the T820 processor. And the input lag here wasn't egregious, but I could definitely feel feel it. To put it into context, with everything else, I didn't even really think about the Bluetooth connection except for with the RG556. I also tested it with the RG Cube, which has the exact same processor and build of Android, and yeah, same issue. So I did find it ironic that the one time I got input lag with the Anbernic controller was with an Anbernic device. Now, setting it up with PC is super easy. For example, with Windows, you do the exact same thing. You connect using the X input, and then you go into the settings and then connect via Bluetooth. And it's the exact same process on both Mac and Linux. For example, I have my ROG Ally X set up to dual boot, both into Windows as well as Bazzite. And the Bazzite side basically functions exactly like a Steam Deck, and so it does connect in the same way. And so yes, I found that across the board, the Bluetooth connection here was pretty good. It's 5.3, it's nice and zippy, and I didn't have any issues actually pairing. I also used the X input mode to connect to a cheaper Anbernic device. This is the RG Cube XX. And this is running on the stock firmware, but as you can see, it's connecting just fine and none of that input lag that I found earlier. Now, in addition to using Bluetooth, you can also use that 2.4 GHz dongle. I have to use a USB-C adapter with my ROG Ally X because it doesn't have a USB-A input, but it's the exact same thing. And like I mentioned before, pairing here is very simple. You'll press the button on the dongle and then press and hold Y and then press the Bluetooth connecting button. After that, they'll find each other and then it'll connect. And like I mentioned earlier, I did a bunch of testing with this setup right here. I was testing out a new laptop, which I reviewed the other day, and the Anbernic controllers were my primary controllers during all of that testing, and they worked great. And then finally, of course, if you want, you can just connect it up wired, and you can use basically any USB-C cable. It should work fine. This will probably give you the least amount of input latency, and it'll also charge your controller at the same time. And then finally, it's also super easy to connect with a Nintendo Switch. From your home menu, just press on the controller icon and then go into Change Grip/Order. And once you're on the screen, all you have to do is just press and hold that Bluetooth pairing button, which by default will go to Nintendo Switch. It'll take a few seconds, but once you're connected, you are good to go. Of course, the button layout on the controller itself is the opposite of what it's going to be on the Nintendo Switch, but the buttons themselves will be in the correct position. Also of note, once you have them paired, all you have to do is press the home button and it's going to wake up your Nintendo Switch from sleep. There are many Bluetooth controllers that do not have this function, so I think it's pretty cool that we're getting it on this one. And then finally, this does support 6-axis gyro controls on the Switch. And so even though it doesn't match the ABXY pattern and also doesn't have Amiibo support, this is still a really solid controller for this console. Okay, so that's it for my testing. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Anbernic RG P01. As always, we're going to start with what I like, and number one thing here is that price point. When they first told me it was going to be a $15 introductory price point, I thought they were joking. The fact that this is Bluetooth 5.3 in addition to all the other connectivity options at this price point makes it a steal. And even though I don't think this will win any awards when it comes to innovation, I love the fact that it's a very familiar shape. I love those 8BitDo Ultimate controllers, and the fact that this feels exactly the same but for cheaper is pretty great. It's also very impressive at this price point that we have all these connectivity options. You've got multiple ways to plug it into any number of PCs or tablets or phones or Nintendo Switch. I also like that we have close to full functionality with the Nintendo Switch in particular. The fact that we have gyro and that you can wake it up from sleep is a nice touch. And finally, probably one of the biggest points that I have for this controller is that it's just very easy to recommend. And we'll talk about that later when we start to wrap things up. Before that, I want to talk about what I don't like about the Anbernic controller. The first is that it does feel kind of cheap. It's a reflection of its price point. If you're looking for a very premium experience, you're going to have to pay more. I also think that the controller itself is kind of ugly. I don't like the big Anbernic logo on the front, and I also think that these color options are a little bit weird. Some of them are a little bit charming, like the purple one is not terrible, but it is a little bit odd. But I am hoping for a little bit more of a clean design. I think the black one is pretty good. Let's see a white one like that too. Now these first two nitpicks are pretty cosmetic, but the third one is not. I don't mind the fact that it has RGB lights on it, but I wish that it would save your RGB settings when you turn the controller off. Because having to cycle through 16 different color options every time you turn on the controller is kind of unacceptable. So I'm hoping this will get fixed in a firmware update down the line. And then finally, I did notice some input lag, but only in one certain use case. Again, it's ironic that it happened with an Anbernic device, but all the same, that does mean that it could happen on something else as well. And again, this could be fixed with a firmware update either on the device or the controller. But when it comes down to it, if I got input lag on one Anbernic device, you might see it on other handhelds as well. Now, as we start to wrap things up, you might be wondering whether or not it's going to be worth picking up the RG P01. And I'm kind of of two minds about it. The first is that this introductory price is so low that yes, I think it's very easy to recommend. But at the same time, I think it is worth comparing against other models at similar price or feature points. Let's start with the 8BitDo Ultimate 2C. These two feel very similar, although the 2C does have updated buttons. In terms of price point, they're about the same. An Anbernic plus shipping is going to be somewhere between like $25 and $30, and the 8BitDo Ultimate 2C goes for $30 on Amazon. Now the big difference here is that the 8BitDo Ultimate 2C has a lot less connectivity options. It's got that 2.4 wireless dongle like the Anbernic one, so you can plug it into a PC, it'll work fine. It does also have Bluetooth, but only for Android. So for example, this controller would not work wirelessly with a PC and would also not work with a Nintendo Switch. So if you want that versatility of being able to use multiple connectivity options, then the Anbernic is going to win hands down. Now the controller that's probably the most similar to the Anbernic one in terms of features is going to be the GameSir Nova Lite. This one has just about the same connectivity options. It's got that dongle and is also Bluetooth capable. And the price point between these is also very similar. The GameSir one is $25, and again, the Anbernic one is, $25 or $30 depending on shipping. But the GameSir does have some advantages, including this really awesome carrying case. Not only does it protect your controller, but it also has a slot for that 2.4 GHz dongle, and I'm always losing these. However, there are some things that the GameSir Nova Lite lacks compared to the Anbernic. First off, this one doesn't have gyro, and it also will not wake up your Nintendo Switch from sleep. In addition, like I showed in my review video of this controller, it does have some software bugs as well. For example, connecting it to a PC would sometimes force it into switch mode, and I actually had to downgrade the firmware just to get it to behave the way I want it. On the other hand, connecting with the Anbernic was great almost all the time, other than that one time with an Anbernic handheld. So whether or not you like one of these controllers over the other is really going to be up to you. I kind of see them as being neck and neck. I like the GameSir case, but I think that the Anbernic is just a little bit more of a seamless integration with my other devices. And then finally, the other comparison I think worth making is with the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth controller. So this one has all the same features and functionality as the Anbernic controller. The newer models now have Hall sensor sticks and triggers, and it's got Bluetooth and 2.4 and can connect to your Switch. The big advantage with this one is the wireless charging dock. I've talked about this a lot in my other reviews, but you essentially can put your 2.4 GHz dongle underneath. From there, you can use a USB cable to connect the dock to your PC, and then you can just use this wirelessly, and it's going to work seamlessly. And so I really like this setup, but like I mentioned before, the price point is quite a bit higher, $60 or $70. And so even though, yes, I prefer the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth controller because it has that dock, I don't think it's worth twice the amount of money. And so again, I'm torn between these two. If you spend a little bit more, I think you will really enjoy the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth. But in the end, if you're just looking for a cheap controller that can do almost all the same things, then I think that the Anbernic controller is still a winner. Like I've mentioned a couple times already, this is a very easy controller to recommend. If someone came to me and said, hey, my kid needs a new controller for their Switch, I would say this one's really easy. And also if someone was looking for a cheap, fully functioning controller to use with their PC or Android tablet, I would also recommend the Anbernic. Like with all things, it's going to come down to value and price, and I think that at this price point, this is probably one of the better buys that you can find on the market. In other words, I'm going to give Anbernic 0 points for originality and 10 points in terms of value. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you looking for a cheap controller that does everything? If so, this one might be a good choice. Or do you think it's worth spending twice as much to get that 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth dock? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.